So in the second part of Unit 8, we were going to talk about the political systems that existed in the 17th and 18th century. Most of Europe was under a model of monarchic absolutism that was an evolution of the authoritarian monarchies that we had seen in the 16th century, for example, Philip II. But at that moment, monarchs still relied on the council of, on the assessment of their councils. And we see that in the 17th and 18th centuries, monarchs tended to accumulate even more power. In order to justify this, some philosophers developed the theory of the divine right, arguing that these monarchs had been directly appointed by God to rule, that they were like a different kind of people, that they had been chosen by God to rule over others, so they were completely different. The main characteristic that helps us to understand what absolutism was is the concentration of power in the monarch. So, although the theory of the division of powers and the three powers did not exist yet, it was a reality that these monarchs concentrated the legislative, executive, and judiciary power. Yeah, they virtually eliminated the parliaments or cortes by not summoning them in many countries for over 100 years, and they developed other mechanisms to pass their laws and to also raise money and taxes and increase the taxes. And this was work with a very developed centralized administration, with a strong bureaucracy that controlled all the territories that depended directly and ultimately on the monarch, and helped the monarch to have a very profitable systems of taxing, obviously for taxes that only were applied to the non-privileged. In the picture we can see Louis XIV, that we already mentioned in the previous video, and Louis is the perfect example of an absolute monarch. He was called the Sun King because it was considered that everything spun around him, as he was at the center, like the sun. He enlightened everybody, and he developed a system in which all the bureaucrats and the nobility depended on him. Yes, so they always owe him favors because all the power depended on him. So his way of ruling was going to be a model for many other European monarchs, including later in the 18th century, for example, the Bourbon monarchs, such as Philip V or later others. And then we have the model of parliamentarism, that it was rarer. It only was developed in 2 countries in Europe, and it was based on the idea that the power was shared between the monarch and the parliament. So in these cases, the parliaments had survived after the Middle Ages and had maintained certain power. So we are going to see how they managed to regain some power in the 17th century. So these parliaments represented the interest of the 3 states of society. So remember that parliaments had a representation of the clergy, the nobility, and the third state that usually was the bourgeoisie. By the 17th century, in the countries where parliamentarism developed, the bourgeoisie had an increasing importance, and they tried to reinforce the role of the parliament as a way to increase their voice that otherwise was not counted in the political decisions. So we have 2 different examples. One example is the example of England. There are some, and the other one we will see, that is the Dutch Republic or the Netherlands. So both countries had some things in common. They were both prosperous countries in the 17th century, with growing urban populations. They were Protestant. They were expanding their colonial markets. In some cases, just at the expense of the decline of the Spanish colonies. They both had prosperous manufactures, mainly textiles, and they also had started processes of privatizing more the land and just seeing the agricultural sector as something that could be could receive investments and could be more productive. In England, these the new owners of land that wanted to invest in order to get more, changing the models that had continued existence since the Middle Ages, were called the gentry. So at the same time, with the turn of the century, there was a new dynasty in England, the Stuart dynasty. And this Stuart dynasty that was closer to the Catholics. They also wanted to impose the absolutist model that was working so well in continental Europe. This was going to cause a double problem. One was because in England, the bourgeoisie had managed to not only keep some power in the parliament, but in general had an increasing power in society. And most of this bourgeoisie was Protestant, whether they were Anglican or they were Puritans, Calvinist, but in England and Scotland were called Puritans. So these two things went together, and they saw this attempt by the Stuarts, this new dynasty, to accumulate more power and diminish the power of the parliament, also as a religious matter of the Catholics. So they put all together, and this caused a confrontation between the parliament and the monarchy of the Stuarts. So this conflict ended up provoking the English Civil War that lasted from 1642 to 1651. In reality, it was a series of 3 wars, so it was on and off. And summarizing, at the end, this war ended with the victory of the parliamentarian army and the execution of Charles I, the king of the Stuarts. So after the victory of the parliamentarists, the idea was that England will be ruled directly by the parliament. There were some problems because the parliament showed also to be corrupt, and just the different interests of the parliamentaries, of the members of the parliament, started to show up. So the commander of the armies of the parliament, Oliver Cromwell, that also was a member of the parliament, started to, in order to solve those problems, ended up just managing to be named Lord Protector, in reality some kind of dictator, that at the end accumulated even more power than the late Charles I. So when he died, the parliament discussed and decided to restore the Stuart dynasty with Charles I's son, Charles II. We can see him in this image, and actually his looks remind us a little bit to the image, if you remember here, of Louis XIV. Yeah, so there was something similar in the way he wanted to be presented. So Charles II started to also make some attempts of accumulating more power, and on his deathbed he converted to Catholicism. So when his son James II, already Catholic too, inherited the crown in 1685, he started to legislate in order to give equal rights to Catholics and Protestants. Because the previous monarchs before the Stuarts had legislated in order to, for example, not allow Catholics to have positions in the public administration and things like that. So, but these attempts of James II to give equal rights to the different religions provoked a revolt in the parliament, and this ended up, and the parliament ended up voting to force James II out, and they gave the throne. They offered the throne to his daughter Mary, who was Protestant, and her husband William of Orange, that was the King of Holland at that moment, that was Protestant too. He was Calvinist. But in order for them to be crowned as King and Queen of England, they had to accept a series of conditions by the Parliament. Basically, that the Parliament was the legislative power of England, so it was the body that created the laws in England, as well as other conditions that meant a bigger control of the Parliament in all political and legislative affairs, so that the monarch needed the consensus of the Parliament in order to rule. And this series of conditions were put together in a document that was called the Bill of Rights, algo así como la Carta de Derechos, that they had to sign, the King and Queen had to sign in order to be named. So this change of power that in reality didn't encompass any violent process was going to be called the Glorious Revolution. Yeah, so this way, England became a parliamentary monarchy, something that remains so. From that moment on, England was going to evolve from this model, but never having another revolution. Next year, in Cuarto, when we study the end of the 18th century and the 19th century, we are going to see how the rest of Europe and many other parts of the world had to pass through way more violent revolutions in order to have changes that England started before. And the other model is the model of the Dutch Republic. So as you know, as you might remember, after the United Provinces gained their independence from the Spanish monarchy in 1648, they constituted the new country as a parliamentary republic. So this occurred because in reality these provinces because they had been rejecting the authority of the Spanish monarchy for a long time, they had developed their own mechanisms of ruling. Yes, so the cities were very powerful and had important, like the town halls, los ayuntamientos, had a strong power with representation of the bourgeoisie and the nobility, and then they also had representation of parliaments on the provinces. So they just used the same model for the republic that had at that moment 7 provinces. So this was going to be very important for the development of the model of the Dutch Republic, that was going to be shaped on the interests of the bourgeoisie, of the Dutch bourgeoisie, and that was going to favor the interest of this bourgeoisie, and, for example, the colonial expansion, and in general, like the economic model based on crafts and trade. So these two models were going to be very important to understand what will happen later in Europe. So we can consider that these are the two models that later were going to inspire the Enlightenment, la Ilustración, and the ideas of democracy and liberal regimes that will come up later in time.